Firstly, thanks everyone for coming along to this TASA 2020 virtual workshop. So we're focused here on the topic of universal basic income and really looking at what it is that firstly a UBI might be able to do to help us address social problems, but then also what are some of the more, I suppose, sociological issues that are sitting behind a question like, how fruitful might a UBI be in a place like Australia? So my name is Fabian Cannizzo, which you've probably seen from the tag here. I'm a sessional academic who's been working around Victoria in many different places. Working out at home has had like ups and downs for me because it means that all the travel time that I usually have is being cut out, which is nice, but certainly still very strange to be doing this over the virtual format. So I'll be hosting this first session, first about 2 sessions, and Associate Professor Ben Spies-Butcher has graciously agreed to host our second session in the afternoon, so he'll be taking over at that point. So I just like to say firstly the purpose of this event is, as I said, to explore how UBI might be used to address social issues or what difficulties we might face in sort of trying to lend it to that sort of end. But also the session's really also about encouraging professional development for early career scholars. So our presenters today are getting feedback from respondents, with an eye to help develop their own sense of what the field of UBI studies is about and how their own social research might lend to conversations in that space. So ultimately, one of the aims or products of this session is ultimately going to be a special issue based around papers from within these sessions, but I'm also going to put out a call out for additional papers on the topic of sociology of UBI, what UBI can do for social issues and so forth. So please keep an eye out for that. And if that is something you're interested in, please feel free to send me across an email. You just Google my name and it'll be the first thing that comes up. So just some notes on the order of these events. So as I said before, there are 2 sessions. Oh, no problem. Alison just said that the connection might be a bit poor there. That's all right. So 2 sessions. Each session will have 2 presenters and 4 respondents. 2 respondents assigned to each presenter. So the order will be presenters will present first, and then we'll give a chance for each of the respondents to respond in turn. They can ask a question to the presenters if they'd like to, just whatever you sort of want to do at that point. And then after that, we'll have some time for some open questions from audience members and some floor discussion. We're going to take a 10-minute break between the 2 sets of presentations. And then after the first session, we'll have an hour break, and then the second session, just to sort of give us some time to use the facilities and whatever else we need to do there. And just a quick plug here. So if you would like to join the Sociology of Work, Labour and Economy thematic group, which is formally hosting this session, please feel free to send myself an email, or you can send one across to Sally Daly, TASA's Executive Officer, for more info on how to do that. And as I mentioned before, if you would like to actually contribute to something like a special issue around this topic, please send myself or Ben an email, and we'll give you some more info on that. So with that all out of the way, I'd like to introduce our first presenter for this session. So our first presenter is Lauren Kelly, who's a Senior Policy Advisor at the United Workers Union. Her paper is entitled, What's Really Essential? Rethinking the Social Value of Labour for a Worker-Centred Response to COVID-19. So Lauren, if you'd like to get set up by sharing your slides, and then just please feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Sure, I'm just going to bring up my slides here. Thanks, Fabian. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So awesome. So hi, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. My name's Lauren Kelly. Before I kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and just acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So the COVID-19 crisis has exposed and exacerbated many of the structural inequalities that have long undermined Australia's workplaces and industrial relations system. And whilst Australian politicians have recently praised frontline workers as essential, these same industries have endured decades of neoliberal restructuring efforts to erode workers' bargaining power and increase the incidence of precarious work, wage stagnation and wage theft. And this moment of great disruption presents an opportunity to reconsider the social value of labour and advance new solutions for these enduring problems. And while the concept of universal basic income has received renewed attention in recent months, this paper considers alternative measures to address inequality and transform the world of work. The first, social wealth funds as a mechanism for redistributing the nation's wealth and ensuring a greater return of those profits from capital back to labour. Second, implementation of universal basic services that would also be extended to temporary visa holders and undocumented workers as well. And lastly, a coherent project to rebuild Australian unions and an industrial relations system that's actually fit for purpose in the modern economy. And taken together, it's my view that these proposals could go a long way towards advancing a more sustainable vision for the economy and future of work. So it's been a big year for all of us, and the COVID-19 pandemic has really reignited these important debates concerning the future of work, the value we place on essential industries, and particularly those who work in them. And as many sectors came to a standstill in March of this year, there was a really stark contrast drawn between those who could comfortably transition to working from home arrangements, people such as myself, parents who took up the impossible double shift, and those who continue to face up to work every day, albeit now with face masks and gloves. And an unusual run on toilet paper prompted many Australians to consider, seemingly for the first time, exactly how do products actually get to the supermarket? Where are they made? Is the production environment safe and virus-free? What are the working conditions like? Do we even have warehouses in Australia? Where's the toilet paper even coming from? And how does it get from the warehouses to the supermarket? And what we saw was essential workers in the spotlight and praised as heroes. And for a brief moment, there was this collective and deeply uncomfortable acknowledgement that some of the lowest paid, most precarious workers in this country were doing the work that really mattered to keep everything going, and everyone else was relying on them to keep fronting up to work and to keep doing it. And this pandemic laid bare a status quo that has reproduced inequality and exploitation for too many for too long. And it really felt like the future was up for grabs and all we had to do was seize it. And reflecting on this moment now, just 8 months on, it's clear that this initial ambition and optimism is not really reflected in the broader political response we've seen. It's quite disappointing in a lot of ways. The federal government measures such as JobKeeper diverted much needed income support to employers rather than employees. We know from ATO reports many employers simply stole the subsidy or skimmed it off the top. The doubled job seeker measure was great. It temporarily lifted thousands out of poverty, but it's now steadily being reduced again. And further, the punitive mutual obligations regime has been reinstated, which resulted in the suspension of 74,000 welfare payments in less than 1 month, just between September and October this year. So it feels like we've kind of wound back on some of those progressive measures and we're sort of going back to where we were. And I'm wondering, where do we go from here? I'm in Melbourne, and with the health crisis now seemingly contained for us, attention must again shift to the ambitious ideas that re-emerged at the beginning of this pandemic. And UBI, Universal Basic Income, is one such idea, and I'm going to consider others in what follows. So the Basic Income Earth Network defines basic income as a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. And beyond this basic definition, as many of the presenters here will note, the technical details and modelling of UBI really varies widely. As Spies Butcher, Phillips and Henderson note, we've got some of them with us today, there is no universal consensus on the precise definition, normative justification or policy objectives of basic income. But
I wouldn't trust any of their work.
Bad source, what a dodgy source. And so even though there's all this variation and many technical details that I won't go into in this paper, there are these recurring themes that emerge as justification for a UBI. And ones that I'm really interested in are automation, wage stagnation, and increasing precarity. And whilst I really share the values and ambitions of a progressive UBI, and I agree we must break with kind of traditional labourist attitudes and the professed sanctity of human labour, the right to work, the dignity of labour, all this sort of thing that you actually see quite a bit of in the union movement as well. You know, I know we must address inequality and stagnating wages, prevent harm caused by technological change, and rebuild the welfare system. And very importantly, we need to end precarious working arrangements that keep many in a position of permanent insecurity. However, I argue that demand for a UBI does not address the structural realities that confront us, and instead diverts our collective imagination down a technical path of policy fixes rather than engaging in political struggle. And I view this as part of a broader trend of the disenchantment of politics by economics, as William Davies has famously argued. My main contention is that UBI offers technical solutions to fundamentally political problems and will leave these underlying structural inequalities largely undisturbed. And in the context of ever widening asymmetries of power between workers and employers and these ongoing IR flexibility reforms that are being carried out right now, my concern is that UBI could potentially undermine political struggles for higher wages, secure jobs, and a more dignified welfare system. And my view is that the ambitions of a UBI may be better served by alternative measures such as social wealth funds, universal basic services, a non-coercive welfare system, and stronger unions. Now, of course, this is certainly no small undertaking, but I think it's the only way we can really address these structural issues of power and deliver transformative change. So I'm now going to consider two of the issues that are often raised by progressive proponents of UBI, automation and insecure work, and dive into some of the issues surrounding these two topics. So automation is often put forward as a reason for why we need a UBI. The threat of automation continues to dominate future of work narratives. It's argued that labour-saving technologies such as robots, automation and AI will greatly reduce labour demand across a range of industries, resulting in widespread and persistent unemployment. So consequently, income support must be decoupled from employment in a reality where human labour is no longer meaningfully required or becomes obsolete. And this view is underpinned by a few very prominent studies. So notably Frey and Osborne, 2013, who claim that as many as half of the world's jobs in industrialised countries are subject to a high probability of automation. However, the notion that massive swathes of industry and employment will be lost to robots may be overstated, particularly in the case of Australia. In Australia, investment in new technologies has actually been slow for the past decade, reflecting a broad failure of the business sector to innovate, accumulate capital, create new jobs, and improve living standards, as noted by Jim Stanford and others. And widespread automation has certainly captured the Australian imagination, but much less so the Australian economy, which remains suitably less dynamic. And in large part, this owes to a preference for extractive and rent-seeking behaviours rather than investment from capital and new enterprises and true innovation. And in a sense, capital has been on strike for decades, refusing to take risks and innovate for the future. And this sort of thesis is taken up by Aaron Beninav, who writes that the decline in the demand for labour is not due to an unprecedented leap in technological innovation, but to ongoing technological change in an environment of deepening economic stagnation. The fall in labour demand manifests not so much as mass unemployment, but rather as underemployment. And what we're experiencing is the resurgence of automation anxiety as a symptom of our current era, one where the world's economy has failed to create sufficient employment opportunities. My own research investigating the use of new kind of technological change in industries represented by a United Workers Union found that for the most part, technologies are not so much replacing human labour, but are being used to weaken the existing employment relationship. So we're seeing a real escalation in overt and disproportionate uses of surveillance, uses of technology to discipline labour and speed up work time. So my view is that the assumed disappearance of work due to technology is an unhelpful way to characterise the issue. And for workers who are displaced by labour-saving technologies, such as currently the case for many of our members out on strike at a Coles warehouse in Sydney at the moment, a UBI won't compensate for the loss of a full-time secure union job. And the issue is not the rapid destruction of jobs by technology, but the absence of job creation in the wider economy. And the UBI doesn't really get to these systemic issues. On the issue of insecure work, it can be said that the standard employment relationship that characterised post-war Australia has fundamentally broken down, which has given rise to the re-emergence of deeply precarious models of organising work. And rising precarity can affect full-time workers too, and refers not just to the hours and the duration of your employment, but also the quality, conditions and enjoyment of work. These are factors which have been in decline for several decades now. And understandably, UBI advocates often cite the growing incidence of insecure work as a justification for a regular transfer payment that could, smooth over the inconsistencies of precarious income. However, I think UBI doesn't confront the profound shifts that have taken place over the past 30 to 40 years in how we organise work. So employers have access to a range of legal mechanisms that can systematically weaken the employment relationship or outsource it entirely. We've got labour hire, sham contracting, piece rates, casualisation, opaque supply chains, it goes on. And at the industrial level, it seeks to move risk away from the employer and onto workers. And at the social and interpersonal level, it completely erodes any sense of employer accountability and reciprocity. And workplaces characterised as fissured, as David Will would say, are unsafe, anti-democratic and completely unnecessary. So in this context, arguments for UBI are understandable. However, insecure work is not a technical problem or an issue of misaligned labour supply and demand issues. Insecure work is first and foremost an issue of power, and employers choose to outsource the employment relationship and they manufacture shift scarcity to keep workers vulnerable, differential and less likely to join a union. Now, a transfer payment leaves these widening asymmetries of workplace power undisturbed, and indeed UBI could undermine collective efforts to hold employers accountable for the economic reality of their workers. And I argue that if employers are not creating or offering employment opportunities that can reasonably sustain human life, that they should be held accountable for that. And rather than publicly funding the wages shortfall, the state should intervene to abolish ongoing insecure working arrangements and introduce penalties for employers who try to skirt those regulations. And, it's a long shot, but if the state can attempt to criminalise wage theft, which is the case in Victoria and Queensland, I believe the same can be done for ongoing and unnecessary insecure working arrangements. And I think at a broader level, we need to confront the stark reality that the wage labour system has fundamentally broken down. And I think it was always a flawed system. And there's a tension there in propping up what has always been a very exploitative and now a failed system as well. So just to quickly recap, my contention is that whilst UBI in the abstract, I think, is a very attractive measure, it may not go far enough to address structural issues in the world of work. And further, the implementation in this current political context could produce negative outcomes, and we could see it mobilised in ways that are less progressive than intended. It also concentrates a great deal of power in one policy measure, which makes it vulnerable to institutional erosion over time. So I'm going to consider a kind of different variation of a UBI, a social wealth fund or a universal basic dividend. And I would say that UBI is a tax-funded policy, which is why it's favoured by big tech, many on the right, libertarians and industrialists, because it's a publicly funded wage subsidy at a time of persistent wage stagnation. The social wealth funds or universal basic dividend differ to a typical UBI proposal as they're not financed through income taxation. So instead of a horizontal distributive measure that seeks to, take from collective percentage from high income earners and redistribute that to low income earners, it's more vertical in nature, seeking to recoup a return of capital, a return of profit, and proportion of those gains and return that back to labour. And social wealth funds have been successful in Sweden, Norway and Alaska as well. And much like the UBI, there are many variations in modelling and different technical details. One such policy measure, this is an idea of Varoufakis, would be to require that a percentage of capital stock or shares from every initial public offering be channeled into a commons capital depository, with the associated dividend funding a universal basic dividend. And of course, progressive taxation is still extremely important and a part of any functioning democracy. And we could also implement more substantial taxes on wealth and inheritance, and that could feed a social wealth fund also. The thing I like about social wealth funds is it turns a common myth on its head. This idea that wealth is produced by individuals, taxed, and then collectivized by the state. But in practice, wealth is always produced collectively and then privatized by those with the power to do so, the propertied class. And as Mariana Mazzucato has argued, in the current ecosystem of innovation, many firms rely upon publicly subsidized research and investment and socialize, all the risk and then yet privatize the gains of their innovation. I think a social dividend recognizes the public has a right to share in the gains made from innovation and new technologies supported by public investment. Social wealth funds could also alleviate automation anxiety by ensuring workers benefit directly from public investment and capital. Again, Yanis Varoufakis argues this simple practical measure would be a portion of the machines for every company to become the property of everyone, with the percentage of profits corresponding to that portion flowing into a common fund to be shared equally by all. Of course, the challenge here in the context of a stagnating economy is to ensure that the new technologies we're developing actually are generating new wealth rather than just being put into these hot new commodities of surveillance and things that just are extracting value rather than producing anything. And a further advantage is that it goes beyond income inequality. So a social wealth fund is significant because the significance of asset inflation in contrast with wage deflation, as taken up by Lisa Atkins, Martin Connings and others, at a time when asset and capital ownership generates significantly more wealth than incomes, the utility of a UBI, to my mind, is drawn into question. Universal basic services, it's often presented as you have to choose between a UBI or UBS. I'm sure many on the panel would agree you don't have to choose between the two. You can certainly have both. I think UBS sits alongside a redistributive measure like a UBI or a universal basic dividend in a really powerful way. Low-income households spend a disproportionate amount of their total income on essential social goods. However, the cost of housing, healthcare, education and childcare is rising faster than incomes, and it'll certainly continue to rise faster than the level of a UBI if it remains a marketed good. And my view is that we could achieve a more egalitarian society through the provision of non-marketed public goods. By international standards, Australia's welfare system is tightly targeted, coercive and inefficient. Australia is the only country in the OECD to outsource 100% of its publicly funded employment services to a private group, which has resulted in this predatory network of job service providers, punitive mutual obligations regime and robo-debt. And excluding the pandemic supplement, the unemployment payment is the second lowest in the OECD, putting people 20% below the poverty line. And the CDP is exceedingly punitive, it's racialised, and it erodes minimum wages, minimum protections like the minimum wage, really basic things. Now, we don't need a UBI to improve Australia's welfare system, and we never could have anticipated that the Morrison government would double Newstart, but they did, which demonstrates that big changes are possible when there's enough public and political pressure to respond. And making the rate, the $550 a week rate, permanent would lift thousands out of poverty and diminish the coercive threat of unemployment, which I think is a really important goal of the UBI. Further, I think it's not convincing that a UBI would lessen the stigma of being a welfare recipient. I think this is a political fight fundamentally to acknowledge the social value in a society. And rather than attempts to sort of sterilise the debate with policy fixes, I actually think we need more moral outrage, not less, to be redirected at the welfare apparatus itself, at the idle rich, and at extractive forces that contribute nothing of value to our society. So I've argued that political problems require political struggle and organising. And unions have long struggled around issues of technological disruption, stagnating wages and insecure work. However, on the whole, it is undeniable that our movement is in decline. And it's understandable that some, including progressives, may have lost hope that unions can deliver transformative change for the world of work at the kind of scale I'm talking about today. And in fact, in some pockets of the global movement, this same disenchantment of politics by economics can be seen taking hold within unions also. This increasing professionalisation of unions, a move towards PR and media campaigns rather than industrial struggles can sort of be seen in a lot of countries, including our own. And much like proponents of UBI, there's preference for electoral and technical fixes to incredibly difficult political challenges. However, unions really should not vacate the space of production and give over this incredible power that we have, however diminished it may currently be. And, despite the many challenges, there are reasons to be optimistic. So in Australia this year, we saw a surge in industrial action, and several unions recorded membership growth at a time of rising unemployment, and even at a time where many of their members were becoming unemployed, they chose to stay on as members. And stagnating wages underpin many UBI proposals, yet industrial action is the solution. In Australia, low wage growth is directly linked to a decline in industrial action, including strikes. And as Stanford and others have noted, Australia has very low industrial action compared to other countries. A key reason for that is that it's very hard to go on strike in Australia. Australia's strike laws are among some of the strictest in the world. And pursuing, you can only go on strike at certain times during bargaining under certain conditions when many parameters have been met. Trying to pursue a common claim across industry is unlawful. Secondary boycott laws are unlawful, and sympathy strikes are also unlawful, which makes Australia a global outlier. And as Professor Andrew Stewart and some others have highlighted, Australia is at odds with international conventions, and this is something the ILO has sort of condemned Australia for the past 30 years. So going on strike really should not be this hard. So in terms of trying to rebuild a coherent movement, there are so many practical measures we can take. We need an IR system that goes beyond limited enterprise bargaining, that actually supports workers to cease work and strike, that encourages the democratic co-design of new technologies in the workplace and protects fundamental workplace conditions. And from here, workers could engage more holistically in social and political life. So that economic security facilitates stronger community organising for big social justice issues of climate crisis and international solidarity. And once the floor is raised, we should again take up the struggle for shorter working hours and more leisure time for all workers, not just those in a secure job. And the state also has a role to play in investing for jobs of the future. So rather than band-aiding poverty wages with a UBI, it should be possible and desirable to work in one of the low-carbon, high social value jobs of the future. In Australia, health and care are our fastest growing industries, but they just don't support a living wage, and they really do require adequate funding and remuneration for that to turn around. So in conclusion, the left, broadly defined, should not abandon political struggle. Organising to transform institutions and structures of power is incredibly difficult, but it's the only process that can bring about systemic change. A working environment in which people can earn a wage that reflects the true social value of their work, affording them comfortable lives, enough time to care for their families and loved ones, pursue other interests, and enjoy leisure time without the intrusion of economic worry. And we must drastically rethink what is really essential, who creates value, who simply extracts value, and what forces in our society actually destroy value. And my view is that essential workers can and should demand more than just a payment. I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Lauren. That's great.
Lauren.
Awesome. So look, I'll just take some time now to hear back from our respondents. So we might firstly start off with Professor Greg Marston, who is a member of the Basic Income Earth Network and Deputy Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Queensland. Greg, go for it.
Thanks, Fabian. Thanks, Ben, for organising, and Lauren for the opportunity to read your paper, which was a compelling vision in terms of progressive social justice, obviously not building just around basic income, but what other alternatives, and I think it's really important to think about that, obviously, because members of the basic income movement and academics on basic income are really clear in many cases to make sure that we don't see UBI as a panacea for all of the kind of problems you recognise, particularly in terms of workplaces, but broader economic and social inequalities. So I very much kind of share on the vision, the progressive vision that's laid out in the paper, and I guess I'll make some comments that are meant to be constructive around some of those alternatives and thinking about those in relation to UBI, so that we can, I guess, problematise not just UBI, but also sovereign wealth funds, universal basic services as well, because I think there can be some ways in which we imagine those that may not necessarily deliver in the way that we think they should be intended. But just in terms of sovereign wealth funds, for example, I think that, you know, in Australia, the timing is important in relation to these, and we really did squander an opportunity with the resources boom in the early part of the 2000s. And instead of setting up a sovereign wealth fund, then, as you know, we handed back about, I think it was $74 billion in income tax cuts, which disproportionately benefited high income earners. And of course, you know, the opportunity to do that, we've set up the future fund, but it's at a much smaller value than we would have been able to do. So there is a question of timing, I think, with wealth funds, and Norway's obviously capitalised much earlier, being the largest wealth fund in the world. I think it's, what is it, $1 trillion. So it dwarfs most of the others in the world. But there are some, I guess, ethical considerations too in relation to sovereign wealth funds in the countries that have the largest. You know, the Norwegian one, obviously, in terms of the oil, and in terms of the Alaskan Permanent Fund on Oil and Gas Reserves. And both the Norwegian government and obviously in terms of Alaska have been less vocal in relation to contribution to the fossil fuels to climate change. I think they're a good idea, but I think we have to think about the source of those funds, and you propose some other ways in which you could fund them that don't have to rely on extractive industries, because obviously we need to make that transition to renewable energies, you know, fairly quickly. So I think those other ways in which we can set those funds up are good, but obviously most of the money's been in relation to extractive industries that are the most profitable. A few things in relation to the framing of the problem. So I guess I would differ a little bit in seeing UBI as not part of what William Davies talks about in relation to the, you know, the disenchantment of politics by economics. And I think in Davies' work, what he's concerned with is kind of economic calculation and the various techniques of speaking truth in relation to a kind of technocratic truth. So he's less interested about neoliberalism as the production of markets, but more around that kind of expertise, and that anyone that questions that expertise, you know, is positioned as not accepting that kind of truth. And I think in terms of UBI, as much as it kind of can be seen as, you know, because it's cash, that it sort of facilitates markets, but I think the egalitarian rationale for UBI, at least, is really to kind of socialise that economic security that you've spoken about, that some people have the privilege of, but that is not available for all, right? And it also says that kind of all work and contribution has value, whether it is in care of yourself, whether it's care of others, or care of the environment. That sort of work that's not determined by the market in the way that you recognise. So potentially, yes, it's cash, but it can also have a decommodifying kind of influence, because it also sets up other forms of care and informal forms of reciprocity that are enabled by the idea. So it has I think, merit that goes beyond just the fact that it is a cash transfer payment that can potentially be decommodified. So I guess I would also think that in terms of seeing UBI as a technical policy fix, I think that really that fight for fair income for all and that economic security for all is a core social justice concern. It's one that we've continued for centuries, you know, going right back to Athens, but also the start of the 20th century in this country in relation to the fight for the pension. So to give people income that is decoupled from labour. So I do see kind of receiving a secure income as a key social justice and as a political struggle, not as a kind of retreat from politics. Because, you know, people do need money in terms of being able to exercise their citizenship and being able to take part in democratic and community life. So yeah, I think that it's important to think about its decommodifying potential as well as the fact. I'd also think that UBI, if it is paid for through tax reform, you know, tax reform is incredibly difficult. political challenge, and we've seen that in this country, that it's very difficult to have a mature debate about tax reform. But what we end up with still is a whole lot of redistribution that happens, of course, in the Australian welfare state through the tax system, the kind of submerged state, to use Susan Mettler's term. I mean, just in housing alone, for example, housing system, we forego tax revenue in relation to capital gains tax exemptions and negative gearing on the part of the federal government. That roughly equates to what we spend on public housing and rent assistance. So there is a lot of redistribution going on, and reforming that tax system, would be, I guess, redistributing power, but also around taking certain privilege tax advantages that only certain classes have access to. So I think tax reform is obviously political. That makes it difficult, but it's not something we've done very well in with this country. But I do think we need to continue that fight in terms of income tax reform and so on. I also think, just in terms of, as I've mentioned in relation to universal basic services, just a couple of comments on that. I think that universal basic services, as you mentioned, and I share this view, doesn't need to be seen as one or the other. So you can have basic income plus universal basic services. And obviously in Australia, we've got a mixed economy of welfare, where prior, I guess, to the, 20 or so years ago, the state was a dominant provider. Now it's really a contractor of many of those services, particularly in the case of employment services, but it's still there. It's what Frank Castles calls a steady welfare state. We're still spending lots of money, but it's not the public face. It's kind of government at a distance. So I think when we think about universal basic services, it's important to, yes, that they are part of the collective imagination, but basic services or public services don't necessarily feel collective to all of those that use them. And I think we should acknowledge that here as well in relation to their exclusionary aspects. And lots of the struggle with public services in health and education and welfare has been to make them more inclusive. And I think the second thing to say about universal basic services in compared to universal basic income is not to also fall into the trap of seeing poverty as a problem of character rather than a problem of cash, because lots of that public service can come with the kind of soft or hard paternalism, particularly when you're talking about coercive welfare. So we need to keep up the fight in fighting that paternalism in public services as well. And if you think about all the scholarship on street level bureaucracy, for example, from Lipsky on, it really does show the sort of really way in which public servants on the front line can see themselves as kind of agents of the state or agents of citizens, and that can be quite fickle. It can be around how someone's mannerisms or how they present that can determine that kind of interaction with the state in all of those daily interactions that happen across the country. So the policy in terms of being universal and collective may not be the experience of how those services are implemented, particularly when you're talking about Indigenous Australians, that can result in separation of families or in some cases death. So I think we have to not give up on that fight either in relation to how we position that we need to problematise basic services as well. So I guess in conclusion, yes, I'm a defender of obviously public services, but we should acknowledge that the welfare state is a kind of two-headed beast. It's always had care and control as its kind of dual logics, and at certain times the control gets emphasised, and other times some of the care is what gets emphasised, and it can vary by domain. So I think we need to carry on all of those political struggles simultaneously, as you indicated, rather than having to choose. And as you've acknowledged, there's only really a small number of right-leaning kind of libertarians that would argue for cashing out the welfare state and getting that back in the form of a basic income, that most egalitarian advocates for UBI would not want to dismantle the sorts of services that you've advocated for. And similarly, the campaign for workers' rights and strong unions, as you've outlined, absolutely must continue, as does the campaign for unconditional benefits and a real increase in the rate of payment beyond the temporary increase that we got with the coronavirus supplement. So we could start with emphasising the unconditional here, because the U in universal basic income stands for both, and think about the universal later. I mean, this is some of the debate we might have later that Troy and Ben have outlined, a kind of a stepping stones approach to basic income, but that can still set up some problems in terms of in-group and out-group. But I still think, it's one way to sort of demonstrate the merits of a basic income, as many other studies have done. So in conclusion, I would say that yes, UBI isn't the silver bullet, but it's at least a kind of definable bullet, whereas some of the ways in which we might talk about universal basic services or even sovereign wealth funds in an abstract sense, I guess would need some more work to make them as clear as we've been doing with universal basic income, because there are lots of ways in which you can pay for it. It can increase, the exit and voice rights for workers if it's paid at the right kind of level, but it wouldn't do that if it was set at a very low level. So all of those design features are really important in terms of defining whether it is transformative or not. Paid at a very low level to very few people, it's not going to be transformative in the way that you and I would like it to be. So I think there's lots of work to do on the design, but I think that the political struggle is there with UBI as it is in with relation to other services, that it's not simply a technical solution. I think in some ways it can be a kind of Trojan horse in terms of how it could reorientate society and its values in terms of the good life in the 21st century. Obviously, we need to think about that economic prosperity, but within the limits, the ecological limits of a finite planet. So whether we get an increase in less dirty and dangerous jobs, an increase in green jobs, whether it does some of that in relation and in support of the sort of democratic workplaces that you want to see, then I think they could work hand in hand to bring about that kind of result. But there's lots of things that are going to have to work in concert, as you've outlined. So it's good to see those alternatives being put in the discussion. So thanks for that, and I'll shut up. Right.
Thanks so much, Greg. I really appreciate such thoughtful comments. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that, Greg. So we might now hear from Alison. So Alison Pennington is a senior economist at the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work. Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Well, I think building on from Greg's contributions, which I've just put together as it's all been planned out, I think first of all, thank you, Lauren, for a brilliant paper. It's really awesome to see like something comprehensive and something really ambitious be put forward from union voices. And I think that primarily what it looks like you are engaging with is our strategic questions. Questions about, as you outline in the paper, you want to make the case for political struggle rather than any sort of silver bullet or policy technical solution. And so I think what would be, I think reading the paper, I think what would strengthen that argument is if you engaged more sort of strategically or objectively and empirically with that case for how it is that, for instance, industrial action, as you put forward as the primary mechanism and lever by which we are actually going to change the state of play for people, how it is that lever can be used, and how you see the pathway for that happening. I think that there are, I would encourage you to do that, though I also would preface that with, I think I have some kind of questions about whether that is the only thing that we should be doing, or that it's like an either or situation. I think that's what we should be aware of. We can have multiple strategies working alongside each other, and I definitely think organised labour and something like a basic income, the strategies within these spheres can work together. So I would encourage you to incorporate some of the examples of the basic income arguments that you are responding to, because I think the way that it read, it does come across as quite a lot of straw manning. I think some of the claims of policy fixes and technocratic solutions, and I think even the automation hype as the backdrop for a UBI proposal is sort of shifted now because of the reality of this pandemic and massive labour market shock. And is everyone still there? My screen's gone black. Yeah, okay.
Yep, still here.
Cool. So the reality is that we have the largest number of people who are now unemployed or have no relationship to production since the Great Depression. And so I would sort of put that forward as a framing if you were going to bring the paper into the sort of current pandemic framing. What does it mean for a industrial action strategy to bring about higher wages and more jobs for people if we have so many people that have no relationship to work right now and no relationship to production. And this is where we get into those strategic questions of what is the relative strength of a basic income proposal to extend dignity and supports to people that actually allow them to, I would say, take up the fight to be able to push investment. And that's a really big challenge for us at the moment, is how do we force investment? I think another way to see basic income then is like an evolution of the modern welfare state, and something like, perhaps I'll move into like, I guess some examples of how we can kind of start to dissolve what I think is a false dichotomy between basic income proposals and others, including the social wealth funds. Like, I mean, a social wealth fund is it serves a different purpose to a basic income. It's about socializing investment, whereas the basic income is about providing a basic minimum income floor for people. So I think all of these proposals can exist alongside each other, and I think the paper would be strengthened by maybe focusing on your program and your proposals, and not sort of using BI as a counterfactual. So one example I think like that we have to engage with now is the coronavirus supplement, which is extended to more people than just the unemployed. It's 2.3 million people, and only 1 million of those people, 1 million of them are not on job seeker. So as an example of where I think that basic income actually can help to meet the demands and the needs of expanding power in work, that's what unions do, is if you see like Capital's response to the coronavirus supplement is to say that we have labour shortages now in low wage, entry-level jobs, and they're on the front page of papers everywhere saying that. And so this is a clear example that by basic income advocates and organised labour should be best buddies, because we want to say that employers need to increase the number of hours available, provide full-time jobs, higher wages if they want to attract people who are getting more money on the supplement at the moment. And I think that's a task to sort of mend the divide or start talking about these proposals in relation to organised labour. How much time do I have left? Because I got a few more notes.
Just a couple of minutes, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think what I'll say one point on the social wealth funds, because I think I was really excited to read about that being discussed in the Australian context, and I think if you, and I'm suggesting you kind of maybe use the BI counterfactual to more frame your introduction, but then focus on hashing out what a social wealth fund proposal could look like in Australia, because that would I think that'd be an awesome contribution. One thing to think about is that a social wealth fund, it plays a different role. It seeks to socialise investment as it's made. But because we are in this great economic shock whereby investment, at least private investment, has collapsed, the problem we have now is that we have to force public investment. And forcing public investment to a point where we can draw capital to the table in a crowding in sort of scenario, we are looking at decades of struggle and decades of policy work to extract what's rightfully owed to workers through something like a social wealth fund. So I think the time horizon of the social wealth fund is many decades. Whereas the appeal in a crisis of a policy like basic income, it sits in a different place. Another issue is to think about the direction or the type of investment that we have in Australia, because we have very powerful sections of foreign-owned capital, which dominate both our economy and our politics. And so there's always going to be this question of how do we reel in and ground profits domestically to be able to extract or to siphon off some of that value and socialise investment for workers. So I will perhaps conclude by saying, for trade unionists, I think we can see basic income. It can certainly increase and strengthen the power of workers and help us to strengthen industrial action and all of the ways that we have to protect and enhance workers' rights. But to get there, of course, those proposals have to be designed properly. They have to strengthen our existing benefits and our protections and our services rather than replace them. And I think we have to be prepared to critique those proposals like those very outlandish ones. But I think we are moving into different territory now. And I think it's possible for a basic income to be, pursued as part of that more comprehensive, progressive economic policy that you are, or suite of policies that you're also putting forward. And I'll leave that. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much for that, Alison. So look, we are formally at the end of the first session. So if anyone does need to take a break and run off to the restroom or whatever, please feel free to do so. But just in case there were any audience members with any burning questions for Lauren or respondents, we'll start with Troy. Jump in, go for it.
Thanks a lot, Lauren, and thanks a lot to the two respondents as well. I'll probably have about 20 points, but I'll limit it to one because I don't want to annoy people. But I'm going to focus in on the social wealth fund, right? And my main critique of it, and there are several critiques of it, but it takes far too long to accumulate a social wealth fund big enough to distribute a useful social dividend. So even with the Alaskan example that we always go on and on about, that's taken 40 years to get to a point where it gives between $1,000 or $2,000 per Alaskan resident, which doesn't come anywhere close to a basic income. And we can talk about the sovereign wealth fund is good for other reasons, but whether it's actually existing sovereign wealth funds or ones that are modeled in basic income scenarios, and I've read a lot of papers about them, they take too long. So if you think about political strategy, going to unions or unionists or potential union members and say, hey guys, how do you feel about this thing that you're going to get maybe after you die or when you're 70? I don't think is going to be a powerful political organizing strategy. On the other side, ScoMo, of all people, just demonstrated that we can introduce what is a form of basic income instantaneously through deficit financing, and it puts money in people's hands straight away. You can work out the tax changes afterwards, but the expensive bit of what ScoMo did is JobKeeper, the wage subsidy, not job seeker, and there's absolutely no fiscal reason why in a single budget, removing conditionality and increasing the rate, we could instantly have that form of income security with no waiting around for 30 or 40 years. So that'd be my one sort of critique. And sorry, finally, very quickly, Yanis Varoufakis, great guy, love him, but James Mead has been writing about that kind of stuff since he wrote about that from the 1930s. Okay, and the strategic challenge there is appropriating capital's wealth in the form of saying, hey, with your shares, by the way, we're going to take 10, 20% for our public wealth fund, as Yanis and others have argued, is really no easier than saying to the wealthy, we're going to tax you more to finance this basic income. So I think you face those same strategic political challenges, the opposition from capital and capitalist, whichever way you
go. Sorry, Lauren, did you want to respond to that?
I just wanted to say thanks to Alison for the comments as well, and also to Troy.
No problem. So one more comment from Ben. Go for it.
Thanks very much. That was a wonderful paper, Lauren, and they were great discussions too. The one thing I just want to quickly is going away from the sovereign wealth fund to, I think, the argument about where does power and political strategy lie, which I think is sort of central to your paper, is a little bit like Greg. I wasn't quite convinced that basic income is necessarily technocratic in the politics versus economics sense. But I think there was kind of like Andrew Yang just mobilised a whole bunch of people very politically. Like that was, I don't know exactly what it was, but it was clearly political, whatever he did in the US elections, and lots of people were involved in it. But I think there was an industrial versus political question. And I think it's really interesting to tease that out, because I think there were moments of ambivalence in your paper about where you were, how to make sense of it. In that, are we at a moment where to win, we need to re-engage industrial struggle, or struggle that is centred around the workplace and the forms of power that people have in the workplace, versus, we might say, politics that's aimed at parliaments primarily, and is mobilised in the ways that we try to influence parliaments. And obviously the two interconnected. But I think thinking through that and drawing it out, like even in that example you gave of why we don't have lots of strike action in Australia, which is because of a difficult industrial relations framework, suggests that ultimately industrial power is actually dependent on political power. That in the way you mobilise people in the workplace, in the end, means you have to mobilise them in parliaments first to create the preconditions to allow industrial struggle. I'm not necessarily sure that's true, but I thought that was a really interesting part of the paper, and a theme that went through all of your examples, and might be worth thinking through too. But I also just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed the paper.
All right. Thanks for that, Ben. So sorry, we just had another quick last-minute question from Judy. Go for it.
Oh, hi. Well, my name's Judy Singer. I have an economic and disability studies background. I'm the person who came up with the neurodiversity movement, which is a huge movement for basically it's becoming commodified, the inclusion of neurodiversity in work. So what I want to talk about, what I want to ask you is, what I'm hearing here is an incredible valorization of paid work. And I'm not hearing much said about disability or neurological difference. For instance, the neurodiverse population, or what they call themselves neurodiverse, it's about 50% of the workforce. And what's happened with neurodiversity is that it's I love the term Trojan horse. It's actually become a Trojan horse in capitalism, because it's starting to force employers for the first time to look at individual needs in terms of people's neurological capacities. So I just want to raise that with you, and I want to know if you consider these factors in your work. The reason I'm here is because I'm giving a talk at Dublin University next week about, and I wanted to use UBI because I like the idea and didn't know much about it. And I just hear this is really fantastic. And from what I've heard, I think this political struggle, and I do come from a left background, is fantastic, but not if you're starving and homeless. So let's begin by setting that base rate, particularly for all the people who are unemployable because of their conditions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Judy. Something I really should have made clearer, maybe when I started off, is definitely my conception of work is sort of the output of human life. So my view is that if you're a member of the working class, you are always working. Women are always working. We work in our homes, we work when we care, and that produces tremendous social value. So I should have really made clear the distinction between work and employment. So I'm really, more interested in thinking about the social value we produce through our work, that's often not acknowledged or valued or remunerated for if it does occur in a market setting. But yeah, certainly that difference between marketed employment and the social value of labour, there's definitely a distinction there that I should have drawn out more clearly. So thanks for pointing that out.
Well, disabled people don't often necessarily produce work, but they produce narratives that inform society and its attitudes to work. So sorry, I just like to get on my hobby horse here.
All right, thanks very much for that, Judy, and for the response there from Lauren.